I'm Steve Johnson, News Director of theDove TV. Watch more videos from the Dove Newsroom at theDove.us.
Okay, welcome back, and asked Steve and Polina to join me on this conversation of church security today in light of what's happened there in South Carolina. And, you know, it was interesting because I think there were two things that came out of talking to Dr. McFarland. One was that the church quickly moved to forgiveness, which calmed the whole politicizing of the event down. And even though it appears to be very racially motivated, it kind of took that out of the equation as well. But it's left the big picture, and that is church security now, and what should we be looking at and doing. And he made the comment of this. He said, I hope we don't go to metal detectors, that the church is still an open, inviting, warm, comfortable, loving place, and we'll ask God to defend us. What's your take, Polina?
I hope we don't go to metal detectors, but I think it may be going that way. If you think historically, churches used to be very open and free, and people would go there and confess their sins out loud in front of everybody. But then the church started being infiltrated by people who are not Christian and are just there to spy on people. And so churches had to take measures to protect themselves. And so, and of course there were persecution and all that. So I think, you know, we may find ourselves in that time. I think what I'm more concerned about right now is the spiritual protection of churches. And I think Dr. McFarland talked a little bit about it, but in your news you had that the acting pastor talked about the evil, and we got to stand up to the evil in this world and show every demon on earth and in hell that we're not going to give in to this. So this is where my heart is right now, is the spiritual protection.
Well, yeah, you know, the church has to be an inviting place because that's what the environment has been all along. But I think that we've also got to be very smart about the opposition we're facing. And, you know, I think of the security team that follows the president around. They're kind of there yet invisible type of a thing. You know, you may see them, you may not. It just all depends how they operate, but you know they're always there. I think that it's important for churches to have a sense of wariness about people who could come to do them harm, because it could be harming fellow parishioners and all the rest. You know, you wouldn't want to have a church where people are afraid to go there because they feel unsafe for them and their families and their kids and all the rest. So I think you got to have some sort of a balance that way, but I think to completely ignore the world in which we live in is probably not a smart thing to do. You know, the idea of being as wise as foxes and all that, still there is some truth in all of that. So I think we can learn from it. I'm afraid that we think, oh, this happens always someplace else. That's one thing, you know, when we've talked about news stories, you'll see some terrible thing that happens in a community, and one of the first reactions from the people is, well, we never thought that happened in our community. Well, it can happen in a global community, no matter where you are.
It was a reality check.
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of those stories from Middle East coming, where people are going to church every Sunday thinking they may not come home. And here it is happening, not in that sense in our country, but who would have thunk? You go into church to pray and you're never coming back.
Well, I think that we need to be wise. There's no question about it. I don't know where you draw the line and all that. Do you know your people? Do those who are in the foyer of a church, do they know who are regular and who would be a guest? Part of the equation is we want everybody to come in. We're doing everything we can to get the unchurched into the church, and we're using every means to do it. And we're inviting all kinds of people with all kinds of issues and backgrounds and problems to come in, because we believe that the church is the place for them to find refuge and to get healed. But up until the time that they are converted, what are we doing? You know, how do we look at this? You know, I was sitting in church Sunday and I thought of this. I saw about 8 or 9 people that I hadn't seen before, and I rejoice in that. They're there. They're in church for the first time. You could tell they're new. You can tell they're even new to church life because they didn't know what to do. They didn't know when to stand and when to sit. You could tell the music and the worship was all new to them. And here's a thought that occurred to me. Forgive me if I don't want to be, you know, alarming, but I thought, what would I do if I saw one of them carrying a gun. I thought, what would I do?
Well,
what would I do if all of a sudden the jacket pulled back or whatever, and there was a gun sitting on the hip? What would I do?
I have biker friends who would be doing that, and they're Christians. So to carry a weapon as a Christian is not something illegal or whatever. I would say, are we prepared to be able to interact should some sort of violence take place? And I think a lot of churches haven't even discussed it.
No.
And I think that's where you have to do it. Because, what you want to say is this: it's not so much that you're scared, that something would happen to me, but you're there protecting other lives as well who are in the church. And I think the church leadership has to look at it saying, we're in a situation that's pretty unusual that way. And there's nothing that's a duality of what we're doing by saying, hey, God can change your life. At the same time, we want to protect the parishioners who are here. And if you're come to do harm, well, we have some things we have to do first to be able to get this scenario straightened out, So I don't know that it's carrying a weapon that's a problem, because you could do that with anything. It's more, are you prepared should some sort of violent or protesting action? We may see that even more depending on what happens with the Supreme Court. We've talked about this. They may not be there to, harm people as much as to protest and unfurl banners. Have churches really talked about what would happen on a Sunday morning if your service were to be broken up because of people in the balcony already starting to shout down, kind of like what we see in Congress? It's already happening elsewhere. And I think it's a whole world we have not really discussed adequately.
I just don't know what protection looks like and security looks like. We have seen it creep in, the need for it. As an example, if you send your child to a nursery, you got to go and get that child from the nursery. You can't let somebody out. You have to sign that person in and out, and all of these things. And I think we've seen the issue of that. Now we're looking at another issue. It may show up in the way of some kind of a protest. What would we do if in the middle of a church service somebody stood up and started protesting whatever it was the pastor was preaching on? What would we do?
All right. Well, I've thought of that many times, sitting in there wondering what would happen there, because you think you've got a controlled environment there, but anything could happen that way, and I think that needs to be discussed. I think some pastors would be better at dealing with that than others, but what about the ushers and the board members who are there? Is there a plan of action for that?
Yeah.
I think that it's a world we live in, and I think we need to discuss it. What would be the appropriate way of doing it? Rather than Armstronging somebody out and just rushing them out, is there another methodology of dealing with the situation?
Sometimes rushing them out and putting them in the headlock would be the answer.
It might be. Then again, it may not. It may not. You may find yourself in a lawsuit because somehow they've been injured or whatever. I mean, this sounds so basic, but I don't think churches have really thought this through much.
Well, no, I think maybe what we're talking about here is churches need to have staff meetings and discussion about security
and action
and an action plan. What do we do if this, that, or the other breaks out?
Let me just throw one other thing. I mentioned that I was at a church service over the weekend, and I got there after the service had started, and there was nobody in the lobby. Now, for a couple reasons, that's probably very wrong. First of all, you have nobody greeting people there to help them if they're new. But secondly, you have a situation now that's total. There's absolutely no sense of security at all. And you could just, think of what could happen in that scenario. So, shouldn't during a service, shouldn't the outer area be manned or womaned, at all times, just for, if not just greeting the people who come in who might be late, thinking the church started at a different time or whatever, but to completely leave it devoid of anything. Talk about an open door policy that doesn't really solve anything. That's what that would be.
Well, let me ask you this in closing. Is the bigger picture here that the church has lost its respect to the point where it's now the target? It's not seen as a place of sacredness. It's not seen as a place as hope and healing. It's seen as a place of controversy. It's seen as a place of where these kinds of acts could be played out. It's seen as a place as whatever they're preaching in there, I oppose it, therefore I'm going to have some form of violence against it.
I think with some groups it is. With others they'd never even think of it in those terms. But I think for some groups they see it as an enemy. Yeah.
Well, do you think, I had another question, do you guys think the way this church handled the tragedy, I mean, what's your take on that?
I thought it couldn't have been handled any better.
Right. Right.
I thought if there was an example, if there was any good that came out of this, it's how they handle it. It reminded me of the killing of the Amish children in the schoolhouse. And immediately the Amish leadership came out and talked about forgiveness. You and I would be stunned if our child was killed in the middle of that. But they came out and did that. And the leaders of this church came out immediately and took the Christian position of forgiveness, and that the shooter would come to Christ, and they prayed for his soul. And by doing that, not only did they display proper Christian virtue, but I think they completely diffused the politicizing of the event, and certainly took the racial issue out of it, even though it was racially motivated. So I thought it was handled. Couldn't have been handled any better.
You know, when I lived in Georgia for 3 years, and I had a lot of, African American friends, and a lot of students in my university were African American, and I've been to a gospel church. And you may think that the way of worship is different, and maybe eccentric or whatever, but when you're there, you have no doubt that they're worshiping. They're with their heart and with their soul and with their body, they're there. And I know when that tragedy happens, once it sunk in, I thought to myself, I mean, that was a really like a punch in the gut. It was like the heart of the Black and African American community was the church. And they were punched in the face. So however, there was like the worst you could do, especially with all the recent racial things that's been going on in the country. And I thought too that if anything good that came out of it was the way they handled it, and showed to the world and to this country that we're still together, we're a faithful community, and we're going to be strong.
Well, we're not going to solve this in one session, but I will say this, that I think that the essence of what we're talking about is maybe your church and leadership need to have a work day where you set aside and say, all right, what are we going to do? How are we going to address this? What is going to be our policy? And what are we going to do if this happens? You set some kind of policy in place, an action plan in place to deal with it. And I just think that's just good stewardship. A lot of this is stress-oriented, and my next guest talks about managing stress. We talked about earlier today, so let me take a quick break and we'll be back.